Welcome to another episode of My Wakeup Call. This is the podcast where I get to know someone a little bit and I decide to save getting to know them much better for the podcast because I know you, my listeners, and thank you for your support, by the way. I don't know, I can't explain how and why this podcast is doing as well as it is, but I know what you listen for is how we get to know our guests. And so far, I think it's been worth the journey. And today I'm really excited because I have Susan Cain as a guest. Let me tell you a little bit about her. She went to Princeton, then she went to Harvard Law School, and she pivoted when she didn't make partner. And she pivoted to trying to discover her own voice in an ocean of transactional minds. And what she came up with was the Quiet Journal, Quiet Power, The Secret Strengths of Introverts, and Quiet, The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking, which spent 8 years on the New York Times bestseller list and has been translated into 40 languages. Her TED Talk has been viewed over 40 million times, and she was named by Bill Gates as one of his all-time favorite talks because he's an introvert, but we don't want to get into him because he's running into a few complications in his life. LinkedIn named her the top 6th influencer in the world, just behind Richard Branson and Melinda Gates. She partners with Malcolm Gladwell, Adam Grant, and Dan Pink to curate the Next Big Idea book club. And they donate all their proceeds to children's literacy programs. Her new masterpiece, Bittersweet, How Sorrow and Longing Make Us Whole, is out now. And as I told her, and I'll admit to you, my listeners, I read it cover to cover, and I'd advise you to do the same. You might actually want to read the last chapter, Coda, first. And you'll understand why if you do that. So Susan, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here with you. And of course, my writer's mind is like, oh, Mark is saying that people should read the last chapter first. I wonder if I should have placed that first in the book because, structuring a book is always the hardest part. But anyway, go ahead.
Which is triggering my first insight into you. Can I give you my first insight?
Yeah, sure.
This could be your next book. I give away book titles and people write them. I was thinking of Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz, and seeking to find out herself. And I think your next book could be titled, There's No Place Like You. Finding your voice in a sea of yada, yada, yada.
Wow. That is so good. And my memory is so bad that I'm literally taking a minute to write that down.
And I'll share something with you in my marketing hat. There's no place like you, finding your true voice in a sea of yada, yada, yada.
Okay. Well, you know that it takes me a gazillion years to write my books. So you'll have to wait a gazillion years to know.
I understand.
But I love that. This is my to-do list. And I literally scribbled it down there so that I wouldn't forget. And
because
my idea file, I love that.
Because I read your book and all the people you've interacted with, you're on a search. And there's a humility to you, and which I think is something that's going to deeply endear you to my listeners. So you're on a search and you're not exactly sure what you're searching for, but you like the journey and all the people you interact with and all these situations you find yourself in. I was especially tickled and bemused when you went to the, what was it, the RAD conference about
the RAD Fest.
The RAD Fest, the immortalists who believe we should live forever. I can tell you, whatever God has planned for me is long enough.
That's so interesting. So you weren't, I mean, maybe we shouldn't get off on that tangent from the very beginning. I don't
We
know,
can
but
we can get anywhere we want to go.
well, I mean, so just to say for listeners who haven't read the book yet, the conference that you're talking about is it's it it's a I think we should talk about, well, okay. It's a conference of people who are trying to live forever, basically, or at the least to radically extend our health spans, so that we can live happy, healthy lives for hundreds, perhaps thousands more years. And I was extremely, well, I don't know. I mean, I found the philosophical questions that were raised by that quest to be just like endlessly interesting. Um, I'm not sure where I come down on it at the end of the day, but I found myself much more sympathetic to their aims than I thought I would at the beginning. I don't think I want to live forever, but is it really true? I mean, you wouldn't, if given the chance to extend your health span, by which I mean not being decrepit, but like living healthily for an extra 50, 100, 200 years, you wouldn't like that chance?
Um, well, I look reasonably good for a guy who's pushing 75.
Are you really? I would have had no idea. You look amazing.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I'll share an anecdote, but I do want to get to your through line and not make this all about me. I was blessed to have 8 mentors. The last one was Larry King, and before him was Warren Bennis.
Mm-hmm.
And Warren taught me a great lesson. And Warren, for our listeners, I think our listeners know him because I talk about him frequently.
Mm-hmm.
He was one of the real thought leaders in the field of leadership.
Yes.
He was to leadership what Marshall Goldsmith is to executive coaching and Peter Drucker is to management. And towards the end of his life, he said to me, because we'd have lunch every month or two, he'd say, Mark, I'm trying to be a good sport. And I said, what do you mean? He said, they parade me around the Marshall School at USC and I'm irrelevant. They say, this is Warren Bennis. He wrote all these books about listening. And the MBAs look up politely and smile, and then they look away. And he said, they don't know who I am, what I've done. And I think he was saying, when you're a thought leader, it's pretty heady stuff. And when you're a thought leader and no one cares anymore, you make a lot of sacrifices in life to feed your thought leadership. Often your family suffers from it because it's very intoxicating when you're at the top of your game and the world wants to spend time with you. And he said, I got to be relevant into my 80s, and most people aren't relevant into their 70s, and it hurts, but I'm trying to be a good sport. So what that taught me is the way to be relevant or stay relevant is to mentor young people for me, late 30s to early 60s, if we're going to live a long time, and do everything I can to help them land in their future. And not make it about me, but make it about their living their full potential, finding their true voice, and distilling, where they might want to land. And that helps me to be relevant. So I mentor about 40 to 50 people at various frequencies, everywhere from once or twice a week to every 6 years. And I think it does keep me relevant. And I want to make it that a distant second to my family, my wife, my children, now my grandchildren, who I absolutely adore.
Yeah, lucky you.
But it was a real lesson for me. And so to answer your question, I think there's a reason for us to not live so long, to make room for younger generations. I forget what the percentage is in terms of the cost of medical care, but how much of it goes towards people in the last year of their life.
Oh yeah, all of that is terrible. But that's why I emphasize the part about living healthily. Like the people who are at this conference trying to help people live longer are not interested in prolonging those years where it's just, a morass of healthcare and suffering and all of that. They're interested in having people live vitally for many, many more years.
Right. But let's
So,
get back to you, because this has been,
okay, I
you
could go
haven't even
down that
talked.
path for, I could talk about that for
I have a
hours.
book behind me called Just Listen, and I look at it to practice what I preach, and I need to do a better job. So what would you say the through line is for you? And you step back and your calling and your purpose and issues you've resolved. I have to ask you about your mother, if she's still with us,
Mhm.
and issues that you're in the process of resolving. But go for it. I'm going to put a sock in my mouth.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I have wanted to be a writer since I was 4 years old. So that's always been, the medium that spoke to me, words, language, like the feeling of when you're reading a book and you feel like you're connecting with the soul of the author who wrote it, who may no longer even be alive, but the moment of that connection. And also like the act of a writer, or really any kind of artist, taking everyday human experience and transforming it into something beautiful and noteworthy, to me is like, that's like an everyday miracle. I love it. And so to me, like just the act of trying to create those everyday miracles myself, whether or not I ever succeed, sure, you want to succeed, but the, the act of trying to create a pearl out of just everyday, dirt is, to me, that's incredible. Um, uh, yeah, and I guess there's also from the time I was around 4, I really do believe in this thing of that the seeds of the person are there from the very earliest days. So also from the time I was around 4, I can distinctly remember wondering, why on earth we were here and what it all meant. So I've been that kind of wanderer and seeker all my life, and have also all my life been fascinated by the ways that humans come in so many different varieties. So, my first book, Quiet, was about the variety of humans who are more quiet and reflective and cerebral and inner directed and all of that. And now this most recent book, Bittersweet, I didn't actually start it thinking that I was writing about the variety of human experience, but I think I really was. I was really interested in the experience that I can only call like a kind of sacred melancholy, like an attunement to the impermanence of the world, to the poignancy of the world, to the fact that the joy and sorrow are always and forever paired. But that somehow with that recognition comes a kind of sense of the beauty of everything, and a sense of deep love and communion that comes from that knowledge. And the fact that some people are more attuned to those bittersweet ways of being than others. And for a lot of people, I think they're born that way. They're born with a highly sensitive temperament that produces that. And for other people, they come to it via life experience. But yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
More than answers my question. Can I throw some unsolicited thoughts about what you've just said?
Sure.
Because I'm picturing you as a young child, and in the book, which is there's some very personal parts, you were really your mother and you were really connected when you were young,
Oh, yeah.
super connected. And but maybe as a young girl, you sense that even though you were super connected, you might not be connected soul to soul, because as you got older and you started to uh, go through high school and then college, and your mother weighed in, being a little bit restricting and restrictive, it seemed like the connection went away. And then you talk about how you have to talk about the anecdote about I gave her my diaries,
Mhm.
and uh, and there may not be any accidents, and it may be that you didn't want her to read them, but maybe you did want her to read them so she could understand you, as you, as opposed to understanding you through her own bias. And it sounded like it didn't particularly work out and created a wedge because rather than understanding the pain underneath what you wrote about in the diary that was connected to her, she reacted to it.
Yeah.
So is any of that accurate, what I'm just saying?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess I would say my mother is still alive now and has Alzheimer's, but is still in some fundamental way very much herself. And there is a way in which our souls are very much the same. We're connected then and remain connected still. And I can talk about that. But also ways, as with all humans, ways in which we're also quite different. But yeah, just to tell listeners the story who haven't read it yet. And I will say, no matter what I'm about to say, I don't think I'll ever be able to say it the way that I can write it, because I don't know, I just find it much easier to write about really deep experiences than to talk about them. Um, but yeah, my mother and I had a kind of you know incredibly deep connection throughout my childhood. Uh, she was my person, I was her person. Um, and I remember my childhood in kind of Garden of Eden like terms. It was just a time of complete happiness and love, and obviously there were the ups and downs of any kid, but basically it was like that. And then as I became a teenager and I was the youngest child, and my mother had a whole bunch of vulnerabilities that made her react really hard to my growing separation and independence. And to my childlike eyes, or adolescent eyes at the time, it seemed to me that she had transformed into a completely different person, because it was like all the love was gone. It was replaced with recriminations and rage and withdrawal. And yeah, and I felt like I had been kicked out of the Garden of Eden. That's really the only way I can think of to describe the enormity of what it felt like. It was like love had withdrawn, like a tidal wave comes delivering love, and then all the water is gone again, something like that. And yeah, and I wrote it all down. But so there was this big struggle about how to be myself and also how to still have that love, because it felt very much like the equation that was presented to me was either you can be loved or you can be yourself, but you can't be both. And I guess I tried to resolve that the way I have done all my life, which is I wrote it all down in my diaries. And I have always written in diaries in a way where like I really, really, really don't want them to be read. Like I write in a completely uncensored way, in a way that you wouldn't do if you think other people would read them. But there came a day when I went to college, and my parent, and for some reason I had to leave school early at the end of freshman year, and my parents came to, I'm sorry, for some reason I was going to stay on campus at the end of freshman year for a few days late. And my parents came to take home my suitcases, though I was going to be remaining. So my parents were arriving and they were walking away with my suitcases. And at the last minute, I handed my mother my diaries. And on a conscious level, I never wanted her to read them. Like I really, really, really didn't want her to read them. I didn't want anyone to read them. But I handed them to her thinking on a conscious level that I was doing that for safekeeping, and that, that of course she would never read anyone's diaries. But of course she did. And I got home to find that as bad as our relationship had been before that, it was really now like on a whole different level of severed. And there were ways in which it remained that way for the next decades. We were still mother and daughter, and we still had family holidays together and all those things, but it was just never the same. until, I mean, should I tell the full story or leave it to people to read it? I don't know.
I had a thought because I read,
Yeah.
as I said, I read the whole book, and being a psychiatrist and specializing in trauma and all that,
Yeah.
I zoomed in on that. So I had a thought to run by you about your mom.
Sure.
Uh, is it possible that she came down on you because she had repressed a lot of her impulsivity at a cost of her own psychological freedom? And there you were acting out on what she'd repressed. And as you were doing that, it might have triggered in her real anxiety, because way, way down deep, underneath her being controlling and critical, was a desire to just throw the mantle of control off her and just act out. And when you were doing it, it may have stirred kind of an internal panic attack, which she converted to anger, because it was something about her, how she lived her psychology.
Yeah.
And there you were living the life that she always wanted. And there was a mixture of jealousy, anger, and fear, because she had so repressed certain things inside herself.
Yeah. I think that's very much spot on. I think that's very much, I would say that analysis is very spot on. That's right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, she had grown up in a very religious Orthodox household, uh, where there are just a lot of strictures as part of everyday life. And she had really just like accepted that and become, I don't want to say an enforcer, that's an overly pejorative word, which I don't really mean, but she had become, you know, someone whose life purpose was to live by those rules and make sure her family did and all of those things. Um, so yeah, you know, I think anytime we make a choice like that, there's always a lot that we're giving up, for sure. And I kind of wasn't buying that way of life, and that would have been experienced also as a real rejection, right? How could it not be? You know, if you decide to dedicate your life to a whole set of principles and then your beloved child decides not to, well, I don't know. I mean, I'm saying how could it not be? I don't know. Maybe it's just that I haven't been tested, but my kids are adolescents now, and I really don't feel like I would be overly I think their principles would have to deviate pretty far from mine for it to be upsetting to me.
Well, maybe again, another part of the book, this is going to whet the listener's
Hmm.
appetite. You talk about epigenetics. So maybe we're talking
Yeah.
about your mom's epigenetics and your epigenetics, but you got to act out on what she repressed.
Yeah, it's very possible. It's very possible. And just for people who aren't familiar with the term epigenetics, it's basically the idea that that when we have life experiences, it it actually affects our genetic profiles in ways that can be inherited by our children and our grandchildren and our great grandchildren and so on. So, like, if you come into this world, for example, predisposed to states of fear or anxiety, it may be because, in part, because your ancestors had traumatic experiences that encoded in the genetic profile that you then inherited. And that sounds kind of far-fetched, but there's all this fascinating research on it that I talk about in the book and talk about my own life experiences with that too.
Yeah, yeah. Is it okay that I'm just sharing, these observations? Because as I said, I read the whole book, and my mind, that's why I read the whole book. Uh, is that all right with you?
Oh, of course. Sure.
So
Sure.
because you're triggering something else in your search. Um, I had a guest on the podcast, Chip Conley. Chip Conley owned Joie de Vivre hotels. He pivoted to Airbnb, and then
Mhm.
he formed the Modern Elder Academy. And when I had him on the podcast, he said he reached a point where he had all the money he needed, but 5 of his friends died by suicide. He was suicidal. He was depressed, and he realized he was addicted to achievement.
Mhm. Mhm.
And as he spoke, I said, and I'm seeing how this lands for you. I said, Chip, it may be that you have the syndrome of disavowed yearning.
Hmm.
And he said, what's that? I said that way down deep, there was some desired experience of wholeness and completeness, but it wasn't to be had. And so you pivoted to what the world rewarded, and it rewarded it big time.
Mm-hmm.
And it got intoxicating, but it became empty. And as you get older, that disavowed yearning for an inherent, maybe existential completeness and wholeness, it's raising its head, because you can't achieve your way out of it. What you can do is reavow the yearning and just experience it,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and then mourn it, but just experience it. So I'm wondering if you have a little bit of that when you talk about the blissful relationship with your mother when you were young, and then you hit teenagers in the diaries, is that there was a real rift and a loss of, emotional connection during some pretty pivotal years. And you're going to make sure that you have a great connection with your kids emotionally.
Mm-hmm.
But those were years that were sort of lost, when you were experimenting, when you were going, it might have been nice to come home to a mom that recepted you with a different kind of attunement instead of estrangement, but that wasn't to be had. And that there's and now that she has Alzheimer's, it's not to be had either. Uh, I want to share something with you, because both my parents had Alzheimer's and they both died. And my father was very critical, and he was a workaholic. And I have two older brothers. I was the youngest, and you could never really please him. And I always wanted to please him, but I realized it was built on fear. And they lived in Florida, and my mom called me one day, and I'm in California, and she said, you got to come and talk to Dad, because he wasn't pleasant. And she said, he's driving me crazy. All day he's spending his time trying to remember what he forgot.
Mm-hmm.
And it's making it worse, and he's making me crazy. You're the shrink in the family. You got to come and talk to him. So I go there. And again, you can understand that, I would have liked to have had a connection with my father, which wasn't to be had, because, he just wasn't who he was all his life. And so for 3 days, I tried to cajole him into taking a walk. And the night before I left, he looked at my mother, and he looked at me, and then he looked at me, and he said, do me a favor. Don't visit so soon.
Oh, gosh.
Get off my effing back.
Mm-hmm.
Just leave me alone. So I didn't sleep that night.
Mm.
And I thought, mission failed. Then the next morning, when I was due to fly out in the afternoon, we were seated out in the porch area, which overlooked a golf course. And he was just staring with his eyes kind of like this. And at that time, I was reading the galleys from my first book. And my first book was called Get Out of Your Own Way. And I was looking at a chapter, and it's 40 self-defeating behaviors. And they're all 3 to 4 pages. And I was reading the chapter that said, one self-defeating behavior is trying to change other people.
Yeah.
And at the end of the chapter, there's these little usable insights. And it said, don't try to change people, accept them as they are and hope they change, rather than not accepting them at all until they change.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I'm reading that and I'm saying, this book could sell. And I looked at my father, who was looking out. And my father, to appreciate what happened next, you need to know that about 20, 30 years earlier, he had colon cancer. And my mother said, don't tell him he has the big C, because he's obsessive compulsive. He won't let it go. He's going along. He's getting the surgery, but don't tell him. So he's someone who doesn't want to know, as we say in the Yiddish, he didn't want to know from nothing,
Yeah.
And,
Yeah. Yeah.
so I put the book down. And this is the power of forgiveness, my own forgiveness. I put it down, I took a breath, and I looked at him. I said, hey, Dad, how are you doing? And it was totally inviting. And he looked at me, and then he looked away, and then he looked at me, and I'd never seen him cry before. And he looked down, and he looked at me, and he said, I never thought it would turn out this way.
Mm. Yeah.
And then for the guy who didn't want to know what the big C was, he scrunched his face up like one of those Apple dolls you get up in Maine, you
Mhm.
know, and he's trying to figure something out. And he said to me, what is Alzheimer's disease?
Hmm.
And you can see I'm feeling it now. I said, well, it's you lose kind of your memory. You can't remember what happened today or 10 minutes ago. You can remember 70 years ago. And then he squinched his face and he looked at me and he said, do I have it?
Hmm.
And I said, I don't know. You used to have a photographic memory, and I don't know. Uh, and then we went for a walk, and then I left. But I hope it's okay. I shared that with you.
Of course, of course.
But it's the power of surrendering a quest that I was still on to make myself complete, because I hadn't emotionally let go of the fact that I would never get from my father what I still needed. And one of the chapters in the book, one of the usable insights is to get what you never got from your parent, become your own grandparent. So what happened is I showed caring compassion to him and understanding that I never got from him, and you let it go. So anyway, I sorry, but you triggered that, and I hadn't thought about that in a long time.
No, that's a beautiful story. Thank you so much for sharing it.
Well, you're welcome. So getting back to your purpose and calling, and take us through writing. You were before I viciously interrupted you.
Not at all.
You were talking about you always wanted to be a writer, and then you were pivoting from from being an associate in a law firm, and you didn't make partner, but you got your chance to be a writer. So talk to us about that time, and then landing in Quiet, and why Quiet, and then from Quiet to Bittersweet.
Yeah, I mean, so basically, I had, as I say, I'd wanted to be a writer since I was 4 years old, but my father had taken me aside at one point and said, it's very romantic to want to be a writer when you're in your teens and early 20s, but when you get to your late 30s and 40s and you're having trouble making a living and supporting yourself, it may not feel so romantic at that time. And at the time, I kind of fiercely resisted that counsel, but then when I thought about it later, I was like, oh, I guess he has a point. So I went to law school, and I actually found law school totally fascinating, and the first years of practicing corporate law totally fascinating. I didn't really belong in it. It wasn't my natural home or natural milieu, but I loved it in a weird way. But then I was starting to burn out, and I didn't make partner. And usually if you don't make partner, you kind of like stick around and think maybe I'll make it next year, or, maybe I'll take a different job within the firm or whatever. But I literally left 2 hours later, like 2 hours later, I was gone. And I didn't know what I was going to do. I thought I would just.
So take us to those 2 hours.
Yeah.
So you told Stephen, I forget his name.
Yes, Stephen Shalin. He's a really nice guy. Yeah.
And so he did it in the most genteel way that he could. What happened in those 2 hours after he told you weren't going to make partner? What happened in your mind?
Oh, well, I was totally devastated at the time. I was like crying, and I had the sense of like, oh my gosh, everything I'd been working like a maniac for 7 years. Like when you're a corporate lawyer, you're like, you're working around the clock, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's very intense. Um, so I just felt this thing of like, um, everything I've been working towards has now come crashing down. I have no idea what I'm doing next. But as I say, I was burned out, and had been having mixed feelings about the work for the past few years. So as soon as I knew that this dream I had had of making partner was no longer coming true.
And the burnout, was it pure exhaustion, or just you were working 16-hour days, or what? Unpack your burnout a little bit.
Oh, well, the burnout was partly, or you could even say in large part, just the crazy hours that I was working, and the fact that when you're a lawyer, you also have no control of your hours. So like you stop making social plans because you don't know if you'll actually be able to get there at the end of the day or not. So like, why get tickets to the concert? Because it might be that at 5 p.m. the phone rings and I find out I have to stay all night. So it's like easier to stop getting the tickets than it is to go through the day kind of wondering if you'll be able to make it or not. And half the time you can't. So it had been like that for all those years. But I also think there was the other piece of the fact of it just not feeling like my natural milieu. It was all the time like speaking a foreign language. Um, and I'd gotten pretty good at speaking the foreign language, and that feels kind of exhilarating. But there was definitely a sense of like, I don't really belong doing this, or in this environment. So I think the burnout came from both of those two sources.
And did you make, when you found in 2 hours, when you decided, did you call anyone? Did you call parents or friends and saying, I'm leaving my law firm, I'm leaving the law? Was there a call you made to anybody?
I'm sure I did. I just don't really remember that part. And when I say leaving, by the way, I did it with a backup plan. I always have a backup plan, which I always advise people. Like our culture always tells us, you should be doing kind of the take the rash, risky move in the direction of your passion. And I actually think it's much easier to embrace your passions if you also have a plan B and don't have to worry. So anyway, what I did is I asked the law firm, can I take a sabbatical, which was a thing that people did. So I knew I could go back if I wanted to, but I didn't have to. So it was actually like perfect. So I asked for a sabbatical, and I think because they felt badly that that I was so crushed, they were like, sure. And so I literally left 2 hours later. I was gone.
Do you know, in retrospect, do you have any did you ever go back and say, why didn't I make partner?
No, because once it was done, I couldn't have cared less. I just didn't care. And and I thought they were right, actually. I thought they made the right decision. I don't think I should have been a partner.
So you think they picked up that you weren't a dyed in the wool lawyer, that that you were coming with mixed motivations, and yes, this was something you had a aptitude for, you were competent in, but it wasn't in your DNA because there was another part of you that was being suppressed.
Yeah, something like that. I mean, I'm sure they didn't have a psychological a version of the situation as the way you just put it. But yeah, something like that. I always felt they made the right decision. I felt like they did me and them a huge favor. So, and I felt that pretty quickly thereafter. Like it wasn't like 10 years later I came to that. I don't remember how long it took, but it wasn't very long.
And did you feel, when you said it didn't take very long, did you feel when this was a right decision? I couldn't have made it for myself. If I'd made partner, I probably would have stuck it out, but I feel a kind of freedom, the beginnings of a kind of exhilaration that you would never have felt as a lawyer. Did any of that happen?
Oh yeah, I think that happened literally that day, even though I was also upset. Um, the first thing I did, I took a subway, I was in Manhattan. The firm was in Lower Manhattan, right across the street from the World Trade Center. And incidentally, this happened just a few months before 9/11. So I escaped that also, which was incredibly lucky. But anyway, I took a subway uptown and went and rented a bike and went riding around Central Park in the middle of the afternoon. And that felt like the most amazing thing because had not been able to do things like that for the past 7 years. So it was like already, within that first afternoon, I was feeling the first shooting tendrils of freedom. Um, and and then that night, I think it was, I started writing a review of a movie I had seen, Legally Blonde. I started writing like a whole analysis of that movie. And I remembered how much I loved writing. And so and so then after that, I looked for a writing class, and I found one at NYU, this class in creative nonfiction writing, which I signed up for. And I think the class started about a week after I had not made partner. And then that like changed everything. I sat there in that class the first night and I was like, yes, this is exactly what I want to be doing. This is it. And I truly never thought that I could ever make a living at writing. I just thought that I was going to organize my life around it, and that would be my hobby that I love to do. And I told myself, the goal is to publish something by the time you're 75. And if you do that, then you're good. And at the time I was like 32 or something, or 33, something like that. So I was giving myself a lot of time.
I want to share
Yeah.
something with you if I can.
Please.
One of my greatest personal accomplishments is I dropped out of medical school twice and finished.
Oh, wow.
And I think I dropped out for
Wow.
untreated depression. And when I took those years off, I didn't do anything medical. I worked in blue collar jobs. It was a little bit like Howard Rourke from The Fountainhead, except I didn't have his courage. I was just doing a blue collar job. And when I finally graduated, and I wasn't a writer back then, I took out a little crappy journal. Keeping a journal was something, as a doctor, you don't keep a journal. And I wrote down my first entry when I graduated was, I can't believe I made it through. They have released the crazy person. And now I have volume 255, 45,000 pages.
Wow.
And
Wow.
so I have 9 books and 1,100 blogs and articles. And and I write, and it's interesting, I write down stuff that if I have a thought or a feeling, even if nobody ever sees it, it's a way of validating. If you have a thought or feeling, Mark, it's at least worth writing down. And
you see it. And you see it. You're writing to yourself also.
Oh, I'm totally writing to myself. Unfortunately, I write like a doctor, so I can't read my writing.
But I almost think it doesn't matter. It's the act of the recording of it.
Right. And when I start to write things that come back and there's a certain theme, I say, oh, that might be able to hold my interest long enough to be a book or an article or something. So, right. So I rarely review what I've written, but you know what it is? I hadn't thought about it. It's something I would like to have expressed to my parents or even my wife and children, who I love and adore, but they have zero interest in this. I mean, they have zero interest in those things because they're living their lives and they're all doing fine. And I'm blessed to have really functional kids and that they have each other's back. And I'll just share this story. My daughter, who's 40 now, and she said when she was young, she said, Dad, if you died and we had a garage sale, we could only sell your journals for 25 cents a piece because they're used. And the irony, and I love the heck out of her. And she was chief of staff to Tim Armstrong at AOL. She ran something called the Makers Conference for women.
Oh yeah, I know the Makers Conference. I think I spoke there.
Yeah, she probably ran into you. She was the COO, but she would say the same thing now.
And is
Their
that,
youth.
is she not a reader?
Um,
Like, does she
no,
not
no, no,
value
no,
the
no.
written
She
word the
likes
way
to
that you do?
read, but um, she now works for Facebook, and everybody loves her because she's so irreverent. So
Mhm.
she's a totally independent, feisty woman who uh, there's not 1 ounce of neediness in her,
Mhm.
and so she's just busy doing life, and we're blessed her with her husband. But I keep writing these little journals, and uh, I couldn't pay my family to read them.
I think it's often that way, though. Yeah, I think it's often that way, that writers' families don't read their work the same way that other people do.
Oh
Um,
yeah, and a lot of
I-
gurus. I know a number of gurus. Warren Bennis. You know. Deepak Chopra, their families just don't listen to them. And part of it is it's kind of intoxicating to be a thought leader, to be famous, and the world, really wants to hear what you have to say. But let's get back to your story. And again, I
but
apologize,
no,
but go ahead.
that's
Yeah.
okay. That's okay. But I am thinking there is something about, like, okay, so you know how in my book Bittersweet, I dedicated the book to Leonard Cohen, and from reading it how much I love his work and how much it has influenced me. Um, I don't know if I would have wanted to meet him in person or to know him deeply out. I mean, of course, in a way I would have loved to, but but there was also a way in which I wouldn't have wanted to know him personally, because there's a way in which he expressed himself and expressed his truths about life through his music and poetry that that I don't even know how to express this exactly, but it's like that is a very particular mode of expression, and when you know the person as the whole person, you start seeing it differently, and it doesn't make it any less valid. It just means that you've now had certain because you know other things about them, it blinds you from being able to see the kind of distilled truths that they've put into, in his case, that he put into his music, or in Warren Bennis's case, that he put into his insights as a management expert. So there's something about
Well, maybe
knowing
you
people
didn't.
that way.
I had the same thing, because there were a number of my mentors who were towards the end of their life. And so they were actually appreciative that a young person like me would really be interested in hearing from them, because when we would meet, they wouldn't listen so much to me. I'd hear their wisdom, which I'm sure their families didn't want to hear.
Yeah.
But I heard later on that some of these mentors who I loved, and I think they loved me, or they appreciated me, earlier in their life, they were kind of narcissistic. And I
Hmm.
didn't want to know that. I liked the fact that they were frozen in agar for me. So I could
Hmm. Hmm.
idealize them, and just take in the benefits of their wisdom and their life experience without feeling disappointment in the fact that they were just human beings with probably some significant flaws personally.
Yeah, in the way that all human beings have significant flaws. Yeah, but when you know somebody only through, I don't know, this is a whole tangent that we could go through, but the whole question of, once you know a writer, artist, or anybody's work, and then you know about their moral compromises, does it taint the work or not? And I tend to think, no, it really doesn't. The work just stands in and of itself.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. So
yeah.
get us back. So you're there, you pivoted, you write quiet, you discover that you're an introvert, you study it, you see that much of what has been created or made great in the world is from people who, it turns out, are introverts, even though when they're on the stage presenting their works and inventions, the world might not see them as introverts, but they were. And so take us through that, because I do want you to give your thoughts about Bittersweet instead of you listening to my thoughts.
Well, I don't know. I mean, basically, I started writing at that moment, and it actually took a while before I wrote Quiet. Before that, I wrote memoirs and plays and poetry. I was just writing in general. And I had this cafe, and Greenwich Village where I lived that was full of other writers and professors. And I would just like go there every day. And I couldn't even believe, that this whole other way of life existed that had been going on in New York City all that time that I'd never seen because I was at the law firm before that. So anyway, I had those years of experimenting and exploring. And then I got the idea for Quiet. And at first, I actually thought I was working on a really weird, idiosyncratic project because no one talked about introverts at that time. And it seemed vaguely embarrassing to talk about it for exactly the reason the book needed to be written. There was a kind of stigma against it. So anyway, I decided to do that project and then all of a sudden it was like dream come true because my agent pitched it to publishing houses and all these people were coming and saying, that's me, that's me, that's me. And that has not stopped ever since, everywhere I go, as you say, like so many people who may present in an extremely competent and confident and outward facing way. That's not really what their true selves are. That's just a persona that they've learned to manage the world, but their true selves are much quieter and more interior. The amount of time we as humans collectively spend that is different from what our preferences would be is enormous. It's enormous. Like, and this is
So
true.
you
Yeah.
validated a huge group of people who recognized themselves in it and recognized also that that something they may have even seen as a weakness in themselves could be a potential strength and a source of all kinds of positive things, but they had interpreted that the world might not see it that way. And so to a certain extent, you validated their experience and liberated a little bit of their self-esteem.
Oh yeah, very, very, very much so. I mean, the letters that have poured in over the years, they all say exactly what you just said, and they come from, the letters are written by kids and teenagers, and then the letters are written by 70-year-olds who say, if only I had known this when I was younger, my whole life could have been different. They're written by people from every walk of life. It's just the most amazing thing. It's like this setting people free psychically, I guess is what I would say. It's an enormous burden to walk around thinking that the way you are is not the way you're supposed to be. And for many introverts, they may not even verbalize that to themselves. It's just a truth they've internalized from the time they were very little. So, yeah, I mean, I love writing and I love I love having these kinds of intellectual and emotional quests. So I'd love to keep doing this for the rest of my life. But it is also true. After I wrote Quiet, I felt from a work point of view, if I never do anything else again, it's okay, because this was just, it's just, yeah.
So how did you discover or the beginnings of Bittersweet? What was going on that caused you to come up with that book and write it?
It really started with music. I mean, as you know from reading it, it quickly became a much, much bigger and deeper project than that. But all my life, I have had this response to Leonard Cohen's music in particular, but to Bittersweet music in general. I would hear that kind of music and just feel the most profound sense of uplift and transcendence and a kind of communion with all of humanity. This feeling of the deepest gratitude towards the musician for being able to transform what clearly began in something painful and to transform it into such beauty. What I've really come to realize in a way is that what other people call God is what I experience when I listen to music. And in fact, in the book, I recount this Hasidic parable where there's a rabbi who sees that there's a member of his congregation who's very indifferent to all his talk of God. And then he hums for, the rabbi hums for this man some bittersweet bars of music, like a bittersweet melody. And the man says, oh, now I understand what you were trying to tell me all this time. Like I'm now feeling this intense longing to be united with God. And I read that and I was like, oh yeah, that's it. I'm that man.
Could,
I
could I
understand
sh-
it completely.
could I share an additional observation about it? Because I love that music, and someone whose music I really loved was Laura Nero.
Oh, I know that name and I don't know her music.
Well, she was famous for Wedding Bell Blues,
Hmm.
uh, but it was not as deep and profound as Leonard Cohen's. But what I wrote about in Just Listen is something I call the mirror neuron gap.
Hmm.
So mirror neurons are seen
Hmm.
to be responsible for imitation learning and empathy, and when they're
Hmm.
missing, related to autism and Asperger's. And
Hmm.
so in Just Listen, what we talked about is that when you're mirroring the outside world and trying to conform emotionally and psychologically to them, there's a wish for them to feel that way towards you. So even if you're not a scorekeeper, there's a wish that if you're caring emotionally, you want to get that caring back. There's a lonesomeness. And when I speak on it, I say one of the reasons we cry at tearjerker movies is because we identify with the conflict between the protagonists. Think of a Silver Lining Playbook with Bradley Cooper and Jennifer Lawrence. We identify they really like each other, but they're not connecting. Is this ever going to happen? And then at the end of the movie, when they connect and they love each other, uh, we cry because we identify with the gap between them through the movie.
Hmm.
And then when the gap is resolved, we cry with relief because we have a desire to have that connection.
Hmm.
And I don't want to take it away from God, but I think what happens, at least for me, when I was listening to that kind of music, there was something in which it seemed to assuage a pain inside, even though it made the pain deeper, but very, very bittersweet. I mean, I love the feeling of what that music did to me, even though
Yeah.
other people who didn't get it would say that's so depressing.
Hmm.
But
Right.
no, no,
Right.
no, no, no. It's uplifting and healing. So
Exactly.
I wanted to throw that out at you because uh, I think that's also what may be going on in our brains, that our mirror neurons and the wish to feel connected with from someone else who really gets us
Oh,
may
I,
be
I,
going on.
no, I totally agree with that. And to me, these are different manifestations of the same thing. I mean, and when I use the word God, you can take it metaphorically or you could take it literally, like depending on where, I don't mean you, but like anyone who's listening, where you personally are situated. Because I think that the key longing really is for ultimate communion. Um, Again, whether you see that as communion with the divine or whether you see it as communion with other beings who matter to you, communion is the wish. And then, or just the wish for, a perfect world where that communion is always intact and everybody's always kind and everyone's always together and the lions always lay down with the lambs. We all have that wish, and music like that is speaking to that wish. But yeah, but the reason I wrote a whole book about this and that it wasn't just about music was that I quickly came to realize that it wasn't only about music, and that this is these are some of the deepest reaches of the human soul and the human experience, and we don't really have a language for talking about it, even though these are some of the best and most profound aspects of ourselves and our ability to connect with each other. And I believe this is the source of human creativity, like this reaching for that world of the lion and the lambs. Like that's what makes us want to like move forward and create things. So yeah, and there's a whole bittersweet tradition of artists and writers and wisdom traditions who have been talking about this for centuries in all our cultures. um, and that was the state that I wanted to explore. And what was really fascinating to me too is that through the book, as I was writing the book, I looked at this state of experience, this bittersweet state of mind, in all different contexts. And I talked about the ways in which bittersweetness has so much to do with connection and creativity. And then it was really only at the end of the writing process that I developed this bittersweet quiz that people can take to measure how prone they are to having these bittersweet states of mind. And I collaborated for the quiz with the psychologists Scott Barry Kaufman and David Yaden. And they like crunched all the data when we were done, and they figured out what was the profile of people who tend to score high on this bittersweet quiz. And sure enough, we found that people who score high on it are also prone to states of absorption, which predict creativity. And they're prone to states of awe and wonder and spirituality and transcendence. So it's like everything that these traditions have been saying and all the psychological research that I was kind of drawing together to explore bittersweetness, like it all came out in those quiz results. But I didn't know that till the very end that would happen. So that was kind of cool.
And to our listeners, yeah, there is early in the book, there is a bittersweet quiz, and it's something to take. And if you're a fan of her book, Quiet, there's a good chance that when you take it, you're going to have increased validation of your worth in being in this planet. I want to share a bittersweet thought with you, if I can, because I really respect your time and you've given me so much of it. I heard a quote from a friend of mine, and I collect quotes, and this one knocked all the other quotes off the table. And the quote is, "Forgiveness is accepting the apology you will never receive."
Oh, wow.
No, oh, wow. When she said that, so I thought of my father who had died 95. And I'm saying this because it may fit with you and your mom, because one of the dismissive things he would say to us, if I came up with something creative, because he was a numbers person, I think a little afraid of the creative side of life. If I came up with anything creative, he would say, "What makes you think you know anything about anything?"
Oh my gosh.
Oh no, very dismissive, and even worse things. So after I heard that, I was driving in a car because it knocked me over. And I imagined him saying to me, "Remember when I used to tell you what makes you think you know anything about anything?" I was really speaking about myself. All I knew about was numbers, and I did pretty well with numbers, but there was a lot of life that I knew nothing about. And when you came up with your creative, crazy ideas, it made me nervous because it put me in touch with all the areas that I didn't know about, and I was incompetent. And I put you down because you made me nervous. But when I see what you've accomplished in life and what you've gone on to do, I want to tell you that I don't deserve you as a son. And I'm proud. I'm proud of what you've done. And I'm sorry. And when I said that, I started to tear up because internally I said, I'm sorry that I held a grudge against you. Probably a number of grudges, because, you did the best with what you had. I understand what it's like to be afraid. Can you support a family? I know what that's like. And I'm a shrink. I mean, I should have known better. So I'm sorry for whatever chip on my shoulder I had that got in the way of our getting closer. And I just hope you're resting in peace. So I just felt compelled to share that with you. So I hope that's okay.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, no, it's beautiful. I hope that did you feel like it set you free when you were able to do that?
Yeah. Oh yeah. It's I use it occasionally, with my wife. I have this quip because I'm a little bit on Twitter, and I said, being tolerated by your spouse hurts until you realize how difficult you are, and then it's a gift.
That's an amazing quote.
Well, the other one's better, but anyway, where can people find? Look, I've taken up too much of your time, and I appreciate your openness to my interrupting your interview to making it about me, and I apologize for that. But
Oh my gosh, not at all. This is it's wonderful for me to have an interview that's more of a conversation. I really, really enjoyed it and getting to know you. So thank you for that.
no.
And where people can find me. So I guess I'd say the best place is to go to my website, which is susancain.net. And you can sign up for my newsletter. We don't ever share your email address, but it's a great way of staying connected. And I'm also on all the social platforms of Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram. Yeah. And of course, the book is Bittersweet, which you can find anywhere. And I'll probably be starting up a podcast in the next year. So you can look for that as well.
That's wonderful. I'm going to end by channeling the mom that you're still waiting to hear something from.
Well, I should say, sorry, before you end that way. I mean, I wrote about this in the book. I've actually had quite a resolution, both through the act of writing, which actually really was an incredibly cathartic experience, as all the cliches will tell you that it is. But also because my mom has Alzheimer's now, she has actually forgotten all of the troubles that we went through. But what remains is the loving self that I remember from my childhood. So like all the years in between, I had actually started to wonder if I had kind of misremembered my childhood, if I had like put an overly shiny gloss on it
Yeah,
in retrospect.
so can I give you the apology that you'll never receive from her, but I think that's in her?
Yeah, sure.
Would that be okay?
Sure.
Because what I hear her saying is not only, I hope you know that I love you, but I'm sorry for you ever thinking I didn't, because one of the things I admire most of you is that you're kind and non-judgmental, something that I never was. And I'm so glad that you have that. And to the part of me that can finally let go of control, because I don't have any control anymore, I'm so proud that you came from me, because you are kind and non-judgmental. And you are. I see that in you, Susan. I mean, it's a wonderful quality you have.
Thank you. Thank you. Even now, I feel the need to say in my mother's defense, like, aside from, I can't explain it. She kind of went off a deep end during all those years, but her true self underneath all that is actually incredibly kind and non-judgmental. So I actually feel the need to say in her defense, that's actually what she's like. But she just had this other layer on top of it that she was wrestling with during those years. But I guess I'm saying in the what I'm seeing now in her moment of Alzheimer's is like her kind, judgmental nature has come back to the fore, and that's been a kind of an amazing redemptive experience.
What you mean? Wait, her judgmental has gone away, or it's come to the fore?
No. Her kindness and her non-judgmentalness has come to the fore. Yeah. Because it's like the demons that she was wrestling with for those years have receded. It's not that they weren't there; they were very much there. I'm very glad they're not right now. But they've receded, and this other aspect of her nature has come back up to the fore. That's what I'm saying.
Well, that's wonderful, and that's
yeah.
You reach a point when you don't really have anything to prove. And as you said in your book, there's something about the impermanence that can maybe allow you to be more humble, more graceful, which is why I think people shouldn't live forever, because I think it does come, when you realize that your life is limited.
Yeah, I believe that too. And as you know from the book, like Laura Karstenson's the psychology professor at Stanford has actually done all these studies showing that. So that's amazing to me. It's
Yeah.
true. I mean, that's part of what a bittersweet mentality does. Like the sense of an awareness of life's fragility, I think really does bring us to a sense of meaning and non-judgment and all of that.
Absolutely. So thank you for being on. My listeners, often when I speak to PR people and they want to send me one of their clients, I say, uh, the purpose of this podcast is for my listeners to fall in love with my guests. Is your client lovable? And you are supremely lovable. So thank you for being on.
Well, thank you so much. And I really enjoyed this.
Thank you. Thank you.